So pretty cool that we had to have breakfast with John Gizzi and Jeffrey Lord and Paul. So that was quite a start for us on this Saturday. But now things get rolling. I want to introduce you to Zack Smith from the Heritage Foundation and a brand new author, by the way, of a new book called Rogue Prosecutors. He's a senior legal fellow and manager of the Supreme Court and Appellate Advocacy Program in the Edwin Meese III Center for Legal and Judicial Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Zack served for several years as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Northern District of Florida. Prior to that, he spent 2 years as an associate at a major D.C. law firm, which he joined after clerking for the Honorable Emmett R. Cox of the U.S. Court of Appeals in the 11th Circuit. Zack received his undergraduate, master's, and law degrees, all from the University of Florida. So can you guess who he's rooting for tonight? He's a Gator fan. Would you please welcome Zack Smith?
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation to speak this morning. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm here to talk today about the issue of rogue prosecutors, the so-called progressive prosecutors that I know, unfortunately, all of you here in Pennsylvania know all too much about because of folks like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia. Now, by way of background, as you just heard, I'm a former federal prosecutor, so I care a lot about law and order and seeking justice, particularly justice for victims. And one day, shortly after I joined the Heritage Foundation, I was reading the Washington Post. Now, that's not something I do often. It's not something I recommend you do often. But I was doing it one day, and I read a story about a local prosecutor right outside of Washington, D.C., who pledged not to seek the death penalty in any case, no matter the offense, no matter how deserving the defendant. And the more I looked, the worse it got. Not only was this prosecutor pledging not to seek the death penalty, he also was pledging not to prosecute entire categories of crimes. And it got worse still, because I found out that not only did this prosecutor in Fairfax County, Virginia, have these policies, but the prosecutor next door in Arlington County also had these policies. And the prosecutor next door in Loudoun County also had these policies. And the more I dug, the more I found, and the more it became apparent that this rogue prosecutor movement was a well-coordinated, well-funded national movement to elect prosecutors who pledged not to prosecute crimes. Now, you can imagine, as a former prosecutor myself, I just couldn't understand it. Why? Why would these prosecutors not want to do their jobs and prosecute crimes? So I thought in our very brief time together this morning, we could cover 3 points. I want to talk about the why. Help us understand why prosecutors are getting elected to office and not prosecuting crimes. Then I want to shift focus, and I want to talk about the how. How are these prosecutors getting elected to office? And I don't think it will come as a shock. George Soros and other liberal billionaires are helping to fund this effort to the tune of millions upon millions of dollars. And then lastly, and most importantly, in some respects, I want to talk about what do we do? What do we do if we're confronted, like the citizens of Philadelphia, with a rogue prosecutor who's in office and refuses to do his or her job? So to understand the why, we have to go all the way back to Berkeley, California in the 1960s and 1970s. Now you can imagine, not many good ideas come out of Berkeley, California, and this is no exception. But in the 1960s and 1970s in Berkeley, California, there was actually a group of radical academics that wanted to abolish all prisons. They're part of something called the prison abolition movement. Have any of you ever heard of Angela Davis by chance, who's part of the radical Weather Underground movement? Well, Angela Davis is part of this prison abolition movement. And in fact, Angela Davis actually wrote a book called Are Prisons Obsolete? Where, guess what? She says they are. And essentially, advocates of this movement don't believe that anyone should go to prison for any reason, no matter how much of a danger they pose, no matter how much harm they have caused to their communities. Now you can imagine, once these prison abolitionists try to take their ideas out of the academic ivory tower and get them enacted into policy, legislators, members of the community, they rightly recoiled from this and said, no, we're not abolishing prisons. People need to go to jail if they've done certain crimes. Well, if we fast forward to the mid-2010s, what many of these prison abolitionists realized is that they don't need to do the very difficult, very expensive work of getting the laws changed if they can simply change who is in charge of enforcing the laws. So around 2015, there were two individuals, one who formerly had worked for George Soros, another who had formerly worked for the ACLU. They decided to test out their idea in Mississippi and Louisiana. And they decided to target who they viewed as the most pro-death penalty DAs in the country. Now, I think it's important to pause here for just a second and understand how local district attorney races typically work. Now, unlike congressional races or gubernatorial races or congressional races, local district attorney races typically are low-profile, low-dollar affairs. Even in very large cities, a $100,000 contribution, a high, almost $100,000 contribution, that's a lot of money in these races. And typically, historically, many times local DA races, they're uncontested. And so these are very low information, low dollar affairs. And I'm just curious to ask, how many of you here know who your local elected district attorney is? I see a good show of hands. That's more than most people where I go and speak. But the fact is, most people don't know who their local DA is and don't really know exactly what the function of their local DA does, what the DA does. And so what these two individuals did, with about $1 million+ in support from George Soros, they went into Louisiana and Mississippi and successfully removed these pro-death penalty DAs from office. And so after they had this proof of concept, they decided to take their idea nationwide and expand the policies they were going to target DAs for prosecuting. And so they went to Chicago, Cook County, Illinois, where Kim Foxx was the first big city DA to receive this type of massive financial support, again from George Soros and other liberal billionaires. And Kim Foxx, not only did she pledge not to seek the death penalty, even in appropriate cases, she pledged not to seek bail, even for those accused of committing violent crime. She pledged not to seek what she called to prosecute so-called quality of life crimes. She said that she could not prosecute things like petty theft, prostitution, simple drug possession, with no adverse consequences to the community. Now, of course, we know that's nonsense. The crime statistics in Chicago speak for themselves and show that that policy doesn't work, and in fact, it leads to more crime. But nonetheless, Kim Foxx was elected, and we saw this movement expand once again, including, as I mentioned earlier, to Philadelphia with Larry Krasner, where Larry Krasner was elected to office with about $1.7 million in financial backing from George Soros. Now, what's interesting, Larry Krasner in particular, he said he views his role as the local elected district attorney to function as a public defender with power. Now, stop and think about that for a minute. The local elected district attorney says that his role is to function as a public defender. Would any of us think that it's okay for a public defender to say they should act essentially as a second prosecutor in the courtroom? No, of course not. And we should expect our district attorneys to function as a district attorney, not as a second public defender. And by way of example, I think it shows just how off course we've gone when you have criminals who have become fans of the local elected district attorney. And in Philadelphia, we know from hearing jail calls and other various sources of information that many local criminals there have affectionately started calling Larry Krasner Uncle Larry, because they know if they're picked up, even if the Philadelphia police arrest them, they likely will not be prosecuted or receive very lenient sentences from Larry Krasner and his office. And unfortunately, the crime statistics in Philadelphia and other cities where these policies have been enacted, they speak for themselves. Philadelphia, for a period of time after Larry Krasner took office, the murder rate more than doubled. In St. Louis, which had another one of these rogue prosecutors, on a per capita basis, they hit all-time highs. And you're seeing this play out time and time and time again. Now, if you listen to these rogue prosecutors try to justify their policies, many will say that the spike in crime, that was a result of COVID-19, the pandemic. But stop and think about it. Many of these prosecutors were elected to office before the pandemic ever became an issue, and the crime rates were already on the rise. Also, stop and think about it. Many of these prosecutors, they try to point the finger and place the blame on other actors in their local communities. But the fact is, the local prosecutor is the linchpin to the criminal justice system. What many people don't realize, it doesn't really matter how many arrests the police make if the prosecutor won't prosecute the offenders. And likewise, it doesn't matter how good the laws are on the books, how good the judges are. Because unless the prosecutor will prosecute these criminals, then they're never going to see the inside of a courtroom. And again, wherever these policies have been enacted, we know that crime and chaos and disorder increase, and many more victims are created, and many members of the community suffer as a result of this. Now, one other thing I want to pause and talk about very briefly before we move on to the what do we do about it piece of the talk today. If you listen to many of these prosecutors, they'll also say that all they're doing is exercising something known as prosecutorial discretion. How many of you have heard that term before? Prosecutorial discretion. Yeah. Well, I think it's important to understand what prosecutorial discretion is and what it is not. Prosecutorial discretion, as has traditionally been understood throughout the course of our country's history, means that a prosecutor looks at the individual facts and circumstances of each case that comes before him or her. Now, that means there may be issues with evidence, so the prosecutor has to dismiss the case. It means that maybe the defendant cuts a deal, cooperates in another case, and so a plea agreement is appropriate. But the key component of prosecutorial discretion, as it's always been understood throughout our country's history, is that it's an individualized determination about each case. What these prosecutors are doing, they're issuing blanket policies. They're simply imposing their own preferred policy preferences over what we, the people, have enacted through our representatives in our state legislators. That is not prosecutorial discretion as it's ever been understood. That is more akin to prosecutorial nullification. It is these rogue prosecutors making themselves one man or one woman super legislators. That is not the role of the prosecutor. That is inappropriate. And when prosecutors enact these blanket non-prosecution, these blanket nullification policies, they should be held appropriately accountable. So that brings us to the last piece. What do we do? What do we do when we're confronted with one of these rogue prosecutors? Well, one of the easiest things to do is to help educate friends and families and neighbors. Now, I know many of you here today said you know who your local elected prosecutor is. That is not true in most places I go and speak. How many of you think your family, your friends, your neighbors know who your local elected prosecutor is? I bet it's fewer. Some, but fewer still. And of those people who do know who their local elected prosecutor is, how many could tell you what the role of the local elected prosecutor is beyond some vague notion of maybe what they've seen on Law & Order or maybe what they've seen on TV? It's far fewer still. But I think it's also important to urge other actors in our political system to hold these prosecutors accountable when they will not do their job. And so, for example, in Pennsylvania, local officials, like the district attorney, can be impeached. And there was an effort to do that with Larry Krasner. It was unsuccessful, but it's important to think about those mechanisms. In my home state of Florida, there were 2 rogue prosecutors who signed blanket pledges not to prosecute certain crimes. And under Florida law, the governor has the ability to suspend local officials from office for misfeasance or malfeasance in office. And the Florida governor, Governor DeSantis, did that. And so different states are going to have different mechanisms in place. The other thing that many state officials are considering, and many state officials should consider as well, is how to reallocate some of the power away from these local elected DAs who refuse to do their job. And often that means giving the state's attorney general the ability to step in, take a second look at certain cases, giving other officials the ability to reassign some of these cases if the local DAs won't do their duty. But look, this is a very real, a very serious problem that's still confronting many communities today. Even today, there are still 60 to 70 rogue prosecutors who hold office and represent a little over half of our nation's population. Now, that doesn't mean that there hasn't been some success in combating this movement. There clearly has been. We saw George Gascon in Los Angeles lose his bid for re-election. We saw Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, Pamela Price in Oakland get recalled and removed from office. We've seen other rogue prosecutors, Marilyn Mosby in Baltimore, lose their bid for re-election. So the good news is that when people understand what the role of the local district attorney is and why it's so important, there is hope and the ability to push back against these radical individuals and their radical policies. but there is still much, much more work to be done. If you're interested in learning more, I had the opportunity to write a book called Rogue Prosecutors: How Radical Soros Lawyers Are Destroying America's Communities. I have some copies available in the foyer at the Heritage table, and I'd be happy to chat with any of you more about this issue. But thank you all for having me here today. I've enjoyed getting a chance to speak with you all. Thank you very much.